today I'm with you to talk a little bit about immigration, because I think it's very important for international students. If you are in Canada to study for longer than 6 months, you probably have a valid study permit. I know that the application process is usually challenging, depending also where the application is submitted. But again, I will talk a little bit about what it means to be a study permit holder. Temporary resident visa may not be of interest. If you have a temporary resident visa that's valid for the period as your study permit, you don't have to worry about it. But if you end up applying for an extension of your study permit, then there are some different kind of expectations with regard to TRV. And then ETA, if you are from countries that are requiring you to have an electronic travel authorization. A little bit about working on and off campus, co-op work permit, post-graduation work permit, what happens after you finish your program, and social insurance number, which is needed if you want to work in Canada, and a little bit about our advising services and contacts. So kind of just an overview. The study permit looks like this. It was approved in the country where you applied for it, but you probably received a letter of introduction. You travel to Canada with your valid passport with the TRV or ETA, right? Like entered, TRV usually entered in your passport, or ETA approved. And then you came to talk to a CBS, Canadian Border Services Agency officer, CBSA officer, sorry. It's my first day now after holidays, so I apologize. Like, again, some terminology maybe haven't been using it for some time. So study permit is valid and usually has a validity of 90 days beyond your anticipated date of program completion. So it's a document that's issued by Immigration, Refugee, Citizenship Canada. It authorizes you to study and stay in Canada legally. It includes some specific conditions, again, whether you may or may not work in Canada, usually valid for 90 days beyond your anticipated date of program completion. And if you need to study longer, let's say you decided to maybe take, I heard earlier, there were many students in engineering. So if you are, for example, doing master's in engineering, but decide to go for graduate diploma, which you haven't made decision earlier, and you need to study for one term longer, you can certainly apply for an extension of your study permit. Or if there are just any delays with your research, being a PhD student, sometimes you may not be able to have that data collection in time and completing it on time, so you can just apply for an extension. But you do need to have a letter from the university supporting that kind of extended study period. And in terms of temporary resident visa, usually valid, has the same validity as your study permit. It sometimes may actually have really a shorter validity. So it may be only valid for, let's say, 6 months, but your study permit may be valid for the entire 4 years of your program. So don't worry about TRV expiring. It's really not a document that has to be valid, but it does not, it would not be possible for you to leave Canada and return with your valid study permit. You do need then to apply for temporary resident visa, because at the bottom of your study permit, I'm just going to go back, it says at the bottom, does not authorize re-entry. So which means you do have to have a valid TRV if you plan to leave Canada and come back. So study permit is not good enough. Then kind of see one of the advisors for support with that. So temporary resident visa is an important document to be aware of, because I've met with students who would panic, come to the office and say, my God, my TRV expired, like, am I in trouble? Well, as long as study permit is valid, then don't worry about TRV. And so if you are a student from one of the countries that doesn't require temporary resident visa, it refers to electronic travel authorization. Usually European countries, I think Japan, South Korea, Australia, right? Like, so usually for exchange students who are coming on a short term and don't need study permit, it may only be an ETA that they would be applying for, and the ETA is valid for 5 years. So now working on campus. Again, this provides just an overview of what you need to know if you want to work on campus. And usually grad students would be working as TAs or research assistants, teaching assistants, research assistants. So you need to have a valid study permit, and you need to have working conditions on your study permit. I don't like to see that sometimes CBSA officers, those who issue and print your study permit, do not enter the conditions for whatever reason. It really does bring challenges with starting to work. actually with being able to apply for SIN number. Social insurance number cannot be issued unless you have study permit that has working conditions on it. So prior to traveling to Canada, I always emphasize kind of when I exchange communication with my students, make sure that you really take a look at that study permit that's printed, make sure that it does have working conditions, because if not, then students would need to apply for an amendment of their study permit. You need to maintain full-time status. This is really important because, again, if at any point students maybe feel a bit overwhelmed, again, going back to Fabiana's earlier presentation on cultural adjustment, overwhelmed with, different stressors, things that are happening, and feel they need to go to part-time, will bring challenges in terms of working on campus as well as off campus. You need to get a social insurance number from Services Canada, and so I have a slide on that. There will be 2 days processing on campus on January 11th and 16th. We are really excited to have partnership with Services Canada, and there is no limit in number of hours to work on campus. So it's not like, you can work off campus 20 hours and that's it. So you can work on campus many hours, unlimited. But again, the idea really is to ensure that you focus on your academic program, on your studies, and really that's the main purpose why you apply to come to Canada. So this is just complimentary to enable you to earn some money or work as a TA or RA. So now, working off campus, probably you heard, and I put here at the bottom, there is a temporary policy allowing students now to work full-time, but I'll go in more details in the following few slides. But again, I really decided to keep the information as they are now from IRCC with regard to number of hours and with regard what it means to work off campus. So as you can see, again, here, full-time, having a valid study permit, having a social insurance number, and you can work only up to 20 hours per week during your academic year and full-time during scheduled breaks. Now, keep in mind that undergraduate students at Western have summer as scheduled break. Graduate students don't have scheduled break. It's just the way Western's academic calendar is structured. So you have 3 terms. If you are starting now in January, your term started on January 1st, will end on April 30th, will start on May 1st, will end on August 31st, will start on September 1st, and will finish on December 31st. So I know when you hear scheduled break, when you hear summer, it's attractive to think, oh, it's scheduled break. Or grad students may sometimes think, well, I'm not taking any courses, I'm really only doing my research. So is that scheduled break? Well, it's really not, because not taking any courses probably requires you still to do some research and focus on your thesis or whatever program you're in. So now this is what stands now if you really review the working conditions for off-campus as an international student. But recently in the fall, IRCC introduced a temporary public policy allowing full-time work. And so I really today with this presentation want to emphasize that while we do have this temporary policy in place, it really depends what situation you're in. So it's not really kind of, taking information and assuming, oh, I heard now I can work if I have a valid study permit. So this is why I decided to kind of include additional information. And again, I'm not going to go in details with it if you think that you are in a different situation, because I assume that not, again, assuming is when you assume, I learned you assume complexity. I assume not all of you are maybe now starting in January and didn't have study permit before. It could be maybe if you studied at another university and transferred now, or if you completed maybe, I don't know, another program and are now starting masters. So again, when we talk about this temporary public policy allowing for full-time work, we need to keep in mind maintained status. So there were 2 dates when they really, even for us in the world of international student advising, became such a complex, became complicated, because you hear you can work full-time, but then you have to really ask questions. Is your study permit valid? Are you really able to work off campus? And then again, did you apply before October 7th, or did you apply after October 7th? Because it is confusing in terms of when you read what it means. For example, if your study permit is expiring and you applied for an extension and you receive your new study permit, actually you may be able to work only until that specific date. So when we talk about maintained status, this is when you apply for an extension of a document that will be expiring soon, and then you're waiting for that document to be extended. So if you are if an international student is in this type of situation, so application for study permit extension was received after October 7th, again, I'm not saying that you may be in this situation, but just kind of keep this in mind. Then if their presently valid study permit will expire between those dates, November 15th, 22 and December 31st this year, then the student is eligible for off-campus work hours public policy, meaning full-time, right? Like between November 15th and the date at which their presently valid study permit expires. So again, I'm just emphasizing the importance of understanding it and not just taking information because you heard you can work full-time, right? Like if you have valid study permit during this time period, and if you didn't really apply for an extension before or after October 7th, then you don't have to worry. But still check with us to make sure that you are in the right, in the kind of appropriate situation to be able to work full time. And then the other one here, which is a little bit more complicated, if the application was received before October 7th. I don't know now if you are in this situation, but the difference between these two is basically that if a study permit extension was if the study permit was valid, like during this time period, but then the study permit will expire before November 15th, right? Like, so if the students were in this situation, then there are some restrictions with until when they can kind of use the temporary public policy and work full time. So just keep this in mind, like we received clarification from IRCC because as much as it sounded really attractive and we were celebrating the fact that students no longer had that restriction to 20 hours, it did bring some, complexity around, does it really apply to everyone? And what are the situations when right, like it may not be possible. And, you know, even maybe if in some of these, you know, when you look at some of these dates, it may be preposterous, because then I would recommend as an advisor, apply for extension of your study permit really close to the expiry date and not too early, because if you receive new study permit, then you are able to work only until that date. Working conditions on your study permit. I mentioned it, how we really expect that CBSA will really print the study permit that will have conditions. They're usually kind of where the red is circled, kind of included in there. It says student may work on or off campus, or they may refer to the regulation 186 and then subsections F, V, or W. So check your study permits, make sure you have these conditions. Otherwise, you may not be able to apply for social insurance number if you plan to do it on those dates when the officers will be on campus. And again, may accept, it may say may accept employment or off campus, or may have these regulations. Co-op work permits. I don't know if you are in an academic program that requires you to complete co-op, internship, experiential learning, practicum, like they're kind of different descriptors of the work integrated learning experience. But immigration, IRCC has the work permit that's called co-op work permit. So we usually refer to it as CWP, so co-op work permit. And so some students who are in the program where the degree requires them to complete the co-op or internship would need to apply for co-op work permit. Processing times for co-op work permit are quite lengthy in Canada right now, so we encourage students to apply earlier. Again, there is temporary public policy that's also applicable to co-op work permit. I'll talk about that. But again, if you think that your program, or if the program is requesting you to complete it and you really need to apply for co-op work permit, please apply earlier, or kind of come and see one of the advisors and we can walk you through the process. You do need to apply for co-op work permit because then the way how the regulation works is the existing conditions that allow you to work on or off campus are really not applicable for co-op work permit. So you need to have co-op work permit in order to engage in an activity of this kind. Western University will be included as your employer. I know it kind of comes often as, well, but I'm not going to work at Western. Well, the thing is that Western, your academic program requires you to complete co-op or internship. So Western is then in the way responsible for making arrangements with your potential employer. And so they will be monitoring closely, right? Like, you know, who your employer will be, because again, this co-op work permit is issued to you only because you already have an existing study permit, or actually in some cases, you may have applied for both at the same time. If you applied from overseas and you know your program already has information that you need to complete co-op. It cannot be used for working off campus in jobs that are not part of the academic position approved by your academic department. You have co-op work permit and you think, hey, it says I can work. But again, it's really only specifically for the positions that are arranged with your academic department, co-op coordinator, whoever was working with you on, again, securing that employment or that position. Now, again, temporary policy does apply for co-op work permit. You may have heard how, you know, international students in Canada now can work full-time, and, you know, international students in Canada now who can work full-time also don't need to apply for co-op work permit because, right, like there is this temporary policy between November 15, 22 and December 31st, 23. Again, here, if the student is eligible for off-campus work hours, public policy for part or kind of the entire period, then under certain criteria, they may not need to apply for co-op work permit. And so this is basically, they don't need, if the entire co-op placement will be between the 15th of November 22 and end of this year. But if you, for example, are supposed to start your co-op, I don't know, on May 1st or maybe on September, but it will go until April 24, you really must apply for co-op work permit. So again, try to really see how this information from here fits your scenario, and then book an appointment with one of the advisors and we can help you interpret that. I really want to make sure that you, if you are in a situation where you came from York University because you completed an undergraduate degree, and then you maybe applied for an extension of your study permit before October 7th, right? Like in anticipation to start with your master's or PhD at Western in January. Again, you may be in a situation that this may be relevant, and then again with the co-op. So it's not really, you know, information is now you can work full-time and now you don't need to apply for co-op work permit. I think at Western, as team of advisors, we've decided to encourage, even if you're in a situation where you don't need, because you don't have to pay for co-op work permit. Application is the fee is waived, or you know, it's not for work permit. We recommend applying simply because an employer may or may not question, right? Like, where is your even right now with students who, for example, can sometimes when they complete their program at Western work under the regulation 186W that allows them to start working with a valid study permit while they're waiting for post-graduation work permit. Some employers I've worked with students are not actually accepting this. I would always tell students, please check with the employer's legal department, like it's the law. But again, some employers seem to be kind of hesitant. They want to see a document, right? Like, so in order for their HR to process it. So we encourage students to apply for co-op work permit, even if they're in the situation that it's not needed. But again, depending on circumstances, please check in with us. Now, working after graduation. So this is a really popular type of work permit because international students are interested in gaining Canadian work experience after they complete their program. And they, of course, are interested, some, not all, in applying for permanent residency. And the idea is really that they need to gain Canadian work experience for a certain time period. Again, if we talk about Canadian experience class, 1 year non-continuous work experience at a skilled level job. So it has to be, I still refer to old National Occupation Classification 0A or B, but there is a new TEF now, the new kind of name for NOC jobs. So jobs that are either professional level, university education required level. It doesn't have to be related to your field, but as long as you work in at the level that's at the skill level. So post-graduation work permit is the way to gain that Canadian work experience. Again, so PGWP is not work specific, so it's an open work permit. You will be applying after you finish your program. While your study permit is valid, you have 180 days to apply. But again, there are some restrictions. If you apply while your study permit is valid, like remember how I said study permit is usually valid 90 days after your anticipated date of program completion. So let's say you're finishing your program on April 30th, study permit is valid until July 31st. During that time period, if you apply for post-graduation work permit, you would be eligible to work in Canada, start working full-time. As soon as you click on that, submit the application and you pay for it, provided that, right, like your study permit was valid and you had these conditions that allow you to work. But this is only while your study permit is valid. If you decide not to apply during the first 90 days and then you go into having a visitor record, again, you need to maintain legal status, then you can still apply for the remaining 90 days because you have a total 180 days. But you cannot start working until you really receive the document. And the current processing times for PGWP is, I think, still, even like with me being on break, I think it's still 4 to 5 months, because there is a document that you will receive from IRCC confirming that you are eligible to start working, right? Like during the period of 120 days, I think. And then if you don't receive the document, you need to inform immigration so you continue working. So to be eligible, you should have completed all your program requirements. We do meet with students who will say, well, I'm just about to finish it. Like my thesis defense is like, in 2 weeks. So can I apply? The answer is no. You really need to have a document from Western that confirms that you met all the program requirements. And that document would be a letter from the Office of the Registrar, Student Center. So, and the document is called PGWP letter. So it's not, you receive something from your department, which may have some relevant information. But in my experience is that it may be missing that you were full-time. It may be missing which date you really met those program requirements. It may be indicating that you will be finishing the program. So some of these kind of wording may really not be good enough for immigration. And unfortunately, we've seen refusals because the proper documentation was not submitted in support of PGWP. The student should have studied continuously full-time. This is really something that I cannot emphasize how important it is, because we've seen immigration refusing applications when students were part-time, unless they were on an authorized leave. Authorized leave means university will confirm that you were approved to be for circumstances beyond your control. And so the only time when an international student would still be eligible for PGWP and be part-time is if they find themselves in the final term. For grad students, we'll see situations where they have only thesis defense. So there would be thesis defense only registration. So they're part-time, they're not full-time. They still would be able to apply for PGWP after they meet program requirements. Again, keep in mind that it is possible only if you were full-time, and it's possible to apply only after you finish the program. And I know one of the popular questions is, how long will my work permit be valid for if my program is like 1 year or 16 months? So I'll just talk a little bit about it. Again, I think I kind of mentioned it in my, just that you do need to have a letter from school, but you also need to have a transcript. So it doesn't have to be an official one. You don't have to order an official one, because it really depends on the timing, right? Like when you will be finishing, when you will be receiving official confirmation that you met program requirements. If you are in a course-based, I'm now referring to grad students, mainly if you are in a course-based program, you cannot really apply until that term that you are still enrolled in finishes. So if you're really studying now from January 1st until December 31st this year, right? Like you will not be able to get a letter or any confirmation until sometime in January, because the university needs to do so-called marks adjudication process. So do not negotiate start date with your employer until you really can apply for PGWP. That's my message, if you can keep that in mind. Because working with students who would say, but my employer wants me to start on January 5th. And it could be that universities simply cannot issue the document that confirms it, even if you met all the program requirements, but on the system, your transcript still indicates that you are in progress. So make sure that kind of the timing of that is something you're aware of. And going back to students who are not in course-based, who are in a thesis-based, so whenever they defend thesis, whenever they have their kind of thesis defense, it doesn't mean that this is the date when they finish program requirements. There may be some minor revisions that you need to do, so it could take a few more weeks for the committee to review it. And then when your department graduate coordinator is able to confirm and say, now you can upload your thesis to Western's library or like to the program, then only then you officially complete it. So this is when the countdown for you of 180 days starts, not necessarily to meet. So it could be that you are supposed to finish your program on December 31st this year, but maybe you defended your thesis like, I don't know, October 1st, right? Like you may be officially completed actually 3 weeks later. So just keep in mind that there are some important dates, right? Like, here to know what and how it works. And again, you must hold a valid study permit when you apply for the work permit if you plan to start working. So within the 90 days period, and please, if you have study permit that's expiring exactly on a date when you are supposed to finish your program, let me use December 31st. Study permit expiring on December 31st, and you're finishing your program on December 31st, please apply for extension of your study permit. Because I think the confusion is like, hey, but I'm going to be done. Well, you will be done, but you still need to have a legal document for the next 90 days in order to transition you to get the proper documentation and apply. And immigration will grant an extension of your study permit based on the fact that you are finishing it exactly on the same day. So we've ran into a few situations. I recall actually April 30th always being a tricky date. Oh, but my study permit, is expiring, but I'm not going to be a student. So you have the right to apply for an extension to ensure that you really have extra 90 days to apply for PGWP. So again, talk to advisor if you have any questions about it. So now permanent residency is something that we do help students with in the office. You can book an appointment. We also have some presentations that we organize in collaboration with our colleagues from IRCC. So there is a federal and provincial permanent residency streams. So the most attractive that we really discuss with students is Canadian Experience class, Express Entry system. I don't know how much you're familiar with it, but it's like the way how Canada manages immigration. So Express Entry is not a stream, it's just the management system. So you enter the pool, you provide all the information about yourself, your age, your educational background, your work experience. Do you have dependents, what their language you need to have. And then if you score high enough to be invited, then you will receive an invitation to apply. You have 60 days to submit all the documents that you told immigration you originally had. And there is a discrepancy between like you may think you have in terms of work experience. Suggestion is not to create profile in anticipation to have 1 year Canadian work experience. You really need to create profile the day when you meet all the requirements. Because if you say you have 1 year Canadian work experience and they invite you and you are supposed to submit documentation, they will refuse you, and it just simply doesn't look good, right? Like to come forward with information that may not be meeting the requirements. Federal skilled worker one is popular, I would say, in my experience working with grad students who work back home as professionals. Because maybe they were working as a professional engineer for a couple of years, and so now they're in Canada doing a PhD, so they may be meeting the requirements for federal skilled. Because Canadian Experience class is specific, it has to be work experience gained while not being a student. So you don't count really your TA-ship or RA-ship experience, right? Like, on the Canadian Experience class. And then the other that is really popular is Ontario Immigrant Nominee Program, OIMP. There is one international students with job offer stream. Sorry, I apologize. I should have added here because again, it's a presentation also for graduate students. I think I just pulled kind of slides from different presentations I did in the past. So international students with job offer stream, but for graduate students, master's and PhD stream is also very popular. So it's not through federal one, like Express Entry, it's an expression of interest through Ontario. So each province has the way to attract kind of potential immigrants. And so again, feel free to book an appointment and learn a little bit about it. We can, explain the process, provide some helpful links, give you some information that you can then kind of start planning earlier. And the social insurance number, this is what it looks like. It's processed by Services Canada. It expires as at the time when your study permit or work permit expires, but again, don't worry, it also does kind of have that implied status. So if you apply for an extension of your study permit and study permit expired, but you didn't receive the new document, SIN will continue to be valid still. So don't think it kind of expired and I should stop working in case if you're working as an international student. So really confidential piece of information. No one should be asking you about your SIN. Unless it's your employer or Canada Revenue Agency. So I'm a little bit confused when I hear students are going to banks and banks are asking them to show SIN number. I'm like thinking, what do you need social insurance number for? So our understanding is that it's a really confidential piece of document and so not for everyone to ask. Also, I heard, I think landlords may be asking, but again, just always ask question. Why do you need my SIN number? It's confidential, right? Like, and see then what their response is. You can go in person to Services Canada on Richmond Street, or you can apply online. If you do apply online, keep in mind that the proof of Canadian address for online application is needed. So again, that did bring some challenges with students in the past. Anything that you feel you want to talk to your advisor about, we have wealth of experience and we'll be able to, if it's not our area of expertise, we'll be able to refer you to the proper resources. So office is open, friendly staff is there. You can email ISC, you can attend remote advising appointments and immigration drop-ins. So every afternoon we have immigration drop-ins from 1 to 4. You simply just walk in and whoever is doing immigration drop-in that day will see you. So I hope that was kind of short and sweet. I really wanted just to give you an idea what immigration services, what immigration information may be relevant to and what services we have. So wishing you all the best and we will be available for Q&A. Thank you.